Ever since entering the Marine Corps, I have been encouraged to improvise, to adapt, to overcome. I never anticipated how valuable that mantra would be in my career as an emergency manager. When I first began in emergency management 21 years ago, I was taught the 4 phases of emergency management: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Those phases have largely been unchanged. What I've come to realize is that there is a fundamental flaw with the concept of recovery, which inhibits us from being more resilient, forward-thinking, and proactive in an incident environment. Instead of recovery, adaptation should be the goal. Adaptation allows us to achieve the goals of recovery while enabling the flexibility to change with the everlasting impacts of a disaster. I believe this is true in every disaster, but never more so clearly demonstrated than with the COVID-19 pandemic. We didn't recover, we adapted. The most traditional definition of recovery is returning back to the way things were before the disaster. The term recover implies going backward or returning, as the prefix re uses the Latin base meaning again. The concept of recovery limits progress and learning because it asks us to look back instead of envisioning a better future. It also encourages a denial of the incident instead of acceptance. Recovery implies getting back to the way things were instead of adjusting to the way things could be. I don't think anyone would argue that as humans we are resistant to change. We hate change. In fact, most public safety organizations, we often joke that the only thing that we hate more than the current situation is change. However, we know from experience that when a disaster occurs, something will inevitably change. Disasters change us personally, and disasters change the world around us. If we accept what change will occur, then we will be less resistant to that change. If we put on an adaptation mindset, we are already prepare our cognitive perspective for the inevitable. We know we will have disasters and we will have to adapt to them. The more we accept that the change is inevitable, the more we will adjust to the change when it occurs. In the COVID-19 pandemic, a return to normal was never an option. The coronavirus will forever be with us, and we have learned to live with it. The short-term adaptation process led us to adapt to conditions by wearing face coverings, implementing social distancing protocols, and installing plexiglass barriers everywhere. We increased our virtual capability, we depended more on delivery services, and moved to outdoor dining. In the long term, we adapted by vaccinating and developing herd immunity. We will never return to life in 2019. We have moved on. We have adapted. An important aspect of healing is accepting what has happened. The world is in a constant state of change. When disasters happen, lives are lost, people are physically and emotionally traumatized, buildings and infrastructure are destroyed and damaged, and lives are changed. The change is forever. The mere act of experiencing the disaster will never be erased. Therefore, to heal appropriately, the goal should not be to go back to the way things were. It should be to acknowledge that the change in the environment and to embrace and take advantage of the opportunities that the change creates. The goal should be to adapt. Adaptation means surviving because you have made changes in your environment or behavior. Adaptation better reflects what we as emergency managers do in the midst and in the aftermath of disaster and better prepares us to mentally meet the challenges of disaster. Adaptation means that during a disaster we will adjust to the impacts of a hazard and will bend to the new conditions. After the disaster, we pursue an improvement in the quality of life. You see, while COVID seems to be the ultimate example of adaptation because we didn't put anything back into place, we didn't go back to a pre-COVID environment, we didn't beat COVID, we learned to live with it, we improvised, we adapted, we overcame. Now in a post-COVID environment, as I reflect on what has occurred, it has become clear to me that in the numerous disasters and emergencies I've dealt with over my career, there isn't a single one that we ever recovered from. We never went back to the way things were. In every case, we adapted, we moved forward. Psychologists will tell you that people suffering from trauma must first acknowledge and recognize the trauma before they can overcome it. Mentally speaking, survivors of any incident need to accept the change in their life, and then they must modify their mental status to change to it. We must adapt. Adaptation applies accepting what has occurred and moving forward. It is similar to that phrase, "It is what it is." There is no benefit from denying what has occurred, only accepting it and making decisions based on the reality of the incident is what allows progress. To use an example from outside emergency management, Congress changes the tax code. An accountant does not waste time during tax filing season wrestling with that change. An accountant knows it is what it is and accepts the codes and fills out the tax forms accordingly to complete the job. In his book, The Human Side of Disaster, Thomas Drabek called on emergency managers to be change agents in their community. That is because he understood that without change, we are committed to continue suffering the same results of hazards time and again. He even indicates in the book that we should never let a disaster go to waste. With disaster comes opportunity. Opportunity enables change. Change is not recovery, it is adaptation. Von Clausewitz tells us that the longer an army continues to fight an enemy, the enemy will eventually adapt to their tactics. We have been fighting the enemy long enough. Tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and earthquakes. Their tactics haven't changed. It is time for us to adapt. It is time for us to change our recovery mindset with a mindset that promotes healing, strengthening, and forward progress in the face of adversity. It is time for us to replace recovery with adaptation.